At the age of 97, Eleanor had lived a full life. Her house, a modest two-story home on a quiet street, was filled with memories. It wasn't a mansion, but to her it was a treasure trove of experiences. This house had been her sanctuary, the place where she had raised children, celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and lived through almost a century of history. Over the years, Eleanor had seen her neighborhood change. New faces had come and gone, but she remained rooted here, as if this house was the only place that truly belonged to her. For a long time, her family had encouraged her to think about moving to a place where she would have more help, maybe a retirement community or a nursing home. They worried about her living alone, especially as she grew older and her health began to decline. Eleanor had never been one to take advice easily. She was independent, stubborn even. But lately, she had started to realize that the daily tasks of maintaining a house were becoming too much. The stairs were harder to climb, the garden needed more attention than she could give, and the simple act of keeping the house clean was becoming a challenge. She had never planned on selling this house. It had been the home she shared with her late husband, and before that, it had been her parents' house. Every room held a memory. The kitchen, where she had spent countless hours cooking meals for her children and grandchildren. The living room, where they had spent evenings together, talking or watching TV. The attic, which was full of old family belongings and antiques that had been passed down through generations. But the thought of leaving it all behind was beginning to weigh heavily on her heart. Her children had offered to help, but she knew it was time to let go. It wasn't just the house she was letting go of, but the life she had built here. The decision wasn't easy. She felt the pull of nostalgia and the comfort of familiarity, but she also knew she couldn't continue to manage it on her own. One morning, after much contemplation, Eleanor decided to do it. She would list the house for sale. She picked up the phone and called a local real estate agent. She wasn't sure how the process worked, but she trusted that they would help her navigate it. The phone rang a few times before someone answered. "Good morning, this is Susan. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was cheerful and professional. "Hello," Eleanor began, her voice soft but firm. "I'm calling about selling my house. I'd like to list it." Susan was taken aback at first. It wasn't every day that someone so elderly called about selling their home. Most of the time it was younger families or people looking to move for one reason or another. But there was something in Eleanor's voice that made Susan pause. It wasn't a rushed decision. Eleanor had clearly thought about it, and her tone suggested she had lived in this house for a long time. "Of course, I'd be happy to help you," Susan said, quickly composing herself. "May I ask how old the house is and what condition it's in?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "The house is old, but it's been well taken care of. It's just time for me to move on." Susan made a note to schedule a meeting. She didn't ask any more questions at that point. It was clear that Eleanor would explain everything in her own time. They agreed on a time for the next day for Susan to come over and take a look at the house. Eleanor hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was done. She had taken the first step toward closing this chapter of her life. The next day, Susan arrived at the house. She had seen plenty of old homes in her career, but there was something about Eleanor's place that intrigued her. When she arrived, the house looked just as expected, charming, well-kept, but clearly not a new build. The front yard was tidy, and the flower beds, though a little overgrown, still showed signs of care. It was a home that had been loved, no question about it. Eleanor greeted her at the door with a warm smile, wearing a soft cardigan and a pair of slippers. She looked frail, but her eyes were sharp. There was no mistaking that she was a woman who had lived through a great deal, and the house reflected that. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said as she led Susan inside. The first thing Susan noticed was the smell, a faint, comforting scent of old wood, furniture polish, and something that could only be described as the scent of history. It was the kind of smell that made you feel like you had entered a place filled with stories. Every piece of furniture, every knick-knack spoke of years of memories. Susan followed Eleanor through the rooms, taking mental notes. The house was well maintained, but it was clear that it hadn't been updated in quite some time. The wallpaper was a little faded in spots, and the carpet looked worn in the high-traffic areas. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with a little work, but it wasn't going to be a quick sell, not in its current condition. Eleanor walked slowly, but there was a quiet dignity in her steps. She led Susan through the living room and into the kitchen. The walls were covered with old family photographs, some in black and white, others in color. The kitchen was small but cozy, with a dining table in the center and cabinets that had clearly seen years of use. "This was where I spent most of my time," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. "Cooking, talking with the children, and later my grandchildren. The smell of my pies in the oven, it's all here." Susan smiled, sensing how much this house meant to Eleanor. She could tell that there was more to this home than just four walls and a roof. It was a living, breathing part of Eleanor's past. The more she listened to Eleanor speak, the more she understood why this decision wasn't easy for her. This was a house full of love, laughter, and memories. As they moved through the rest of the house, Susan began to get a sense of the space. It wasn't large by any means, but it was a home that had been carefully curated over the years. Every room had its own personality. And even though the house was showing signs of age, it was clear that Eleanor had taken great pride in maintaining it. The furniture was worn, but it had character. The paintings on the walls weren't expensive, but they were meaningful. And the clutter, well, there was a lot of it, but it didn't feel like mess. It felt like history, like a life well lived. After a thorough tour, Susan sat down with Eleanor in the living room. They talked about the next steps, getting the house cleaned up, maybe doing some minor repairs and setting a price. Susan made sure to reassure Eleanor that she would help every step of the way. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything," Susan said gently. "This house is special and we'll make sure the right people see it." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I just want to make sure it goes to someone who will appreciate it." Susan left that day with a heavy heart. She had seen many homes in her career, but none quite like this. There was something unique about Eleanor's house, something that couldn't be captured by just looking at the walls and the furniture. It was the people who had lived here that gave it its soul. Eleanor was ready to move on, but Susan knew that this home would be remembered long after the for sale sign came down. That evening, as Eleanor sat alone in the living room, she looked around one last time. The house felt different now, emptier somehow. She wasn't sure if she was ready to say goodbye, but she knew it was time. The decision had been made and there was no turning back. She only hoped that the next owners would feel the same warmth, the same sense of history that she had always felt here. The next morning, Susan sat down at her desk, sipping her coffee as she looked over the notes she had made during her visit to Eleanor's home. She could still picture the soft, welcoming atmosphere of the house, the way the old furniture seemed to hold memories of years gone by, the walls adorned with photos, and the warmth that filled the rooms. There was something special about that house, something that made it stand out from the others she had seen over the years. She had met many people looking to sell, but this felt different. She knew that listing Eleanor's home wouldn't be as simple as a typical sale. It wasn't just about price or renovations. There was a deep emotional connection tied to this house. Eleanor had lived there for decades, raising a family and creating a life that was evident in every corner of the place. But Susan also understood that Eleanor was ready to let go. There was a sense of finality in her decision, a quiet acknowledgement that it was time to move on. Susan made a few calls to her team, setting up an appointment to meet later in the day to discuss the strategy for the listing. As the meeting wrapped up, Susan felt a strong urge to return to Eleanor's house that afternoon. She wanted to take another look, to understand the home even more before they began the process. Eleanor greeted her at the door with a soft smile, though Susan could tell there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. The house felt quieter today, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. "I was hoping you'd come back," Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft. "I know I need to sell, but I'm not sure how to let go." Susan nodded gently, understanding. She had seen this many times before. People holding on to homes that had been a part of their lives for so long. It wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a personal one. This was a home that had witnessed the most significant moments of Eleanor's life, from raising her children to the loss of her husband. It was more than a house. It was a collection of memories. "I understand, Eleanor," Susan said, "but we'll make sure the next owners love it just as much as you have. I promise we'll find the right people." Eleanor led Susan through the house again, this time with a more reflective air. As they walked, Eleanor pointed out small things that held special meaning to her. The wooden rocking chair in the corner of the living room that her grandmother had used when she was a little girl. the small window by the kitchen sink where she'd often stand and look out at the garden. Each corner of the house seemed to hold a story, a memory, a part of Eleanor's past. "I always loved looking out this window," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a trace of nostalgia. "It's where I'd watch the kids play, and later, the grandkids. I guess it's the small moments like that which make this place so special." Susan listened quietly, her heart touched by Eleanor's words. It was clear that every inch of this house was filled with years of love and care. She understood that selling this home wasn't just about putting it on the market. It was about finding a way to pass on its story, its legacy. As they moved through the rooms, Susan took mental notes. She could see the potential of the house despite its age. The layout was still functional, the rooms spacious enough for a family to settle in. The kitchen, while dated, had a charm to it, with its warm wood cabinets and old-fashioned tiles. The bedrooms were cozy, each one filled with the sense that it had once been a place of comfort and peace. Eleanor's bedroom was the last room they visited. It was simple, with soft colors and a small desk by the window where she had written letters over the years. The bed was modest, but the linens were carefully arranged as if Eleanor had spent years tending to every detail. "I haven't really changed much in here since Thomas passed," Eleanor said, her voice softening. "It's just too hard, but it's time now, isn't it?" Susan could feel the weight of Eleanor's words. The passing of her husband Thomas had left a permanent mark on this home, and it was clear that part of Eleanor's attachment to the house came from her love for him. She gently placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," Susan said. "You've taken such good care of this house, and now it's time for someone else to make their own memories here." As they sat down in the living room, Susan went over the practical aspects of selling the house. She explained that they would need to clear out some of the clutter, maybe update a few things to make it more appealing to potential buyers, and set a price based on the current market. Eleanor nodded, but Susan could see the concern in her eyes. "I'm not sure where to start," Eleanor admitted. "There's so much stuff. I don't even know where to begin." Susan smiled kindly. "We'll handle that. You don't need to worry about it. We can have an estate sale or donate things if that's easier for you. I'll be here every step of the way." Eleanor nodded, looking slightly relieved. "I suppose it's time to let go of some of these things. I've kept them all these years, but it's too much now. Maybe someone else will find them useful." Susan spent the next hour walking Eleanor through the process of preparing the house for sale. She talked about the market conditions, about what buyers were looking for, and how to price the house fairly. The conversation turned to the sentimental aspects of the sale, and Susan reassured Eleanor that she didn't have to part with everything if she wasn't ready. There were ways to preserve the history of the home, even if some of the items had to be sold. "Maybe we can save a few things for you," Susan suggested. "Some pieces that are most meaningful to you. We can take photos of the rest, so you have the memories even if you don't have the objects anymore." Eleanor smiled at the idea. "I think I'd like that. It's not about the things, really. It's about the memories. I just don't want to forget." The two of them sat in silence for a while, both thinking about the next steps. Eleanor knew this was the right decision, but there was still a sense of uncertainty. She had lived in this house for so long, and the thought of leaving it behind was difficult. But she also understood that her life was changing, and this home no longer suited her needs. It was time for a new chapter, for both her and the house. "I've lived here almost my whole life," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence. "It's hard to let go, but I think you're right. It's time." Susan smiled softly. "You've done a wonderful job of caring for this home, Eleanor, and I'm sure whoever comes next will appreciate it just as much as you have." That afternoon, Susan left Eleanor's house with a heavy heart. She knew that listing this home would be more than just a business transaction. It would be a journey for both Eleanor and herself. But she also knew that she was in the right place, helping someone make a difficult but necessary decision. The house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a living memory of a life well lived. As Susan drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the house in the distance. It stood there like a silent witness to the many years that had passed. She knew the house would eventually find new owners, but it would never truly be forgotten. Eleanor had made sure of that. Back inside, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the garden one last time. It was hard to say goodbye, but she knew it was time. With a deep breath, she turned away from the window and sat down in her favorite chair. The house felt quieter now, as if it too was waiting for the next chapter to unfold. And though Eleanor felt a sadness in her heart, she also felt a sense of peace. It was time to move on. The following days felt strange for Eleanor. After Susan's visit, she had a clearer picture of what needed to be done, but the weight of the decision still hung heavily on her heart. It wasn't the selling of the house that bothered her. It was the thought of letting go of all the memories. Every corner of the home held a part of her life. The laughter of children running through the halls, the quiet evenings spent with her husband, the holidays, the birthdays. It was hard to believe that soon all of that would belong to someone else. But Eleanor was determined to move forward. She knew it was the right thing to do, even if it felt overwhelming. She spent the next few days packing up things she could part with: old clothes, kitchen gadgets that she hadn't used in years, and books she had read countless times. Some items were easy to let go of. Others, like her husband's old tools, or the lace curtains she had sewn herself, were harder. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away. They were part of the life she had built here, and parting with them felt like losing a piece of her past. Susan had assured her that they would find a way to make it easier. She suggested hiring a team to help clear out the house and organize an estate sale. But Eleanor wanted to go through things herself, at least for a little while. She felt like she needed to touch every object, to hold it in her hands, and to decide if it was time to let it go. The process was slow and emotional, but Eleanor was making progress. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the attic. The small room had always been a place of mystery for her children. It was filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and things they hadn't needed in years. The attic had once been a place where Eleanor stored things she wasn't ready to part with, but now it seemed like a place of quiet reflection. It was dusty up there, and the floor creaked under her feet as she moved around, but it felt oddly comforting to be surrounded by memories of the past. As she opened a few of the boxes, she discovered things she had completely forgotten about: childhood drawings from her children, old holiday decorations, and even a few of her husband's things. There was a box filled with old letters from the time when they had first met. Eleanor smiled softly as she read through them, remembering the excitement and joy of young love. The letters spoke of hopes for the future, dreams of travel, and promises that they would always be there for each other. It was a different time, a simpler time, and the words on the pages felt like a piece of her heart. As Eleanor read through the letters, she felt a pang of grief for her husband. He had passed away years ago, but sometimes it felt as though he was still with her, lingering in the corners of the house. She could almost hear his voice calling her from the kitchen, or see his shadow as he moved through the halls. The thought of leaving this place, the place where they had shared so much, was still difficult. But as she closed the box of letters, she felt a sense of acceptance wash over her. She knew that she could keep the memories without holding on to every physical object. The house had been the backdrop for her life, but it wasn't the house itself that made her who she was. It was the people, the experiences, and the love that had filled it. The next day, Susan returned to help with the next steps. She had brought in a team of organizers who were experts in estate sales and helping families downsize. Eleanor was still hesitant about letting go of certain things, but Susan was patient, guiding her through the process and reminding her that she didn't have to make decisions all at once. Together they sorted through the boxes in the attic. Some things went to the estate sale, while others were donated to local charities. Eleanor was surprised at how much she could part with once she started the process. It felt good to know that her things would be given a new life, even if they weren't staying in the family. There were items that she couldn't part with, of course. The old rocking chair her grandmother had given her, a few pieces of jewelry that had been passed down from her mother. These things stayed. She also decided to keep a few family photographs and her favorite books, but the rest, well, it was time to let go. As the team cleared out the house, Eleanor spent her time going through the rooms, one last time, taking in everything around her. She stopped in the living room, where she had spent so many evenings with her family. The worn sofa, the wooden coffee table with its deep scratches, each one a testament to years of love and laughter. She ran her fingers over the surface of the table, remembering the countless cups of tea she had shared with friends, the long talks with her children, the quiet moments of solitude. The memories felt real, even without the objects that had once filled the space. She smiled softly, knowing that she didn't need to hold on to every item to hold on to the love that had shaped her life. Susan and her team worked tirelessly, clearing the rooms and preparing the house for sale. As they worked, Eleanor found herself spending more time outside in the garden, which had always been her favorite place. She had spent years tending to the flowers, planting seeds, and watching them grow. The garden was an extension of her home, a peaceful retreat where she could reflect and find comfort. She had always loved the way the roses bloomed in the spring, the way the sun filtered through the trees in the late afternoon, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Standing in the garden, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. She could hear the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds in the distance. This was the last time she would stand here, and the thought filled her with both sadness and peace. She had created this garden with her own hands, and now it would be left behind for someone else to enjoy. But she took comfort in the knowledge that the garden, like the house, would continue to be a place of beauty and peace for whoever came next. Later that day, Susan came to check on the progress. She could see that Eleanor was tired, but there was a quiet strength about her. The process of letting go had been hard, but she was doing it with grace. The house was nearly ready for its first showing. The rooms were cleared out, the furniture had been rearranged to make the space feel more open, and the old belongings were either sold, donated, or carefully packed away for Eleanor to keep. "We're almost there," Susan said, her voice full of reassurance. "The house looks beautiful. It's ready for the market." Eleanor smiled, though her eyes seemed distant for a moment. "I never imagined it would be so hard," she said softly. "But I'm ready now. I know it's time." Susan nodded, understanding. "You've done an incredible job taking care of this home. It's a special place, Eleanor, and it will find someone who will appreciate it just as much as you have." Eleanor stood for a moment in the doorway, looking out at the garden one last time. She could hear the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and for a brief moment, she could almost feel her husband beside her, his hand on her shoulder, guiding her forward. It was time to let go, but she knew that the love and the memories would stay with her forever. The house may change hands, but the life she had lived here would always be a part of her. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned away from the garden and walked back into the house. She was ready. She had made peace with the decision, and as she sat down in her favorite chair one last time, she felt a quiet sense of calm. She had loved this house, and it had loved her back. Now it was time for someone else to make it their home. The day of the first house showing arrived sooner than Eleanor expected. It was a bright morning, the kind where sunlight poured through the windows, lighting up every corner of the home. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish, a scent that made the house feel clean and welcoming. Susan and her team had done an incredible job preparing everything. The furniture was arranged neatly, the curtains were drawn back to let in light, and a vase of fresh flowers sat on the table by the window. Eleanor walked through the house slowly, her hand brushing lightly against the walls as she passed. She wanted to take it all in one more time before strangers came to walk through. Every room seemed to whisper a story back to her. The living room spoke of laughter and family gatherings. The kitchen reminded her of the countless meals she had cooked. Even the old staircase creaked in a familiar rhythm, as if it knew her steps by heart. Susan arrived just as Eleanor was finishing her slow walk through the rooms. She looked at Eleanor kindly, sensing her mix of sadness and peace. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. "I think people are going to fall in love with this place." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I hope so," she said. "It deserves someone who will love it like I did." The first few visitors arrived not long after. Young couples, small families, people looking for a home that felt alive. Susan welcomed each of them warmly, showing them around and explaining the history of the house. She was careful to highlight the details that made it special: the handcrafted woodwork, the cozy fireplace, the large garden out back. Everyone seemed impressed, but what really caught their attention was the atmosphere. The house felt lived in, loved, and full of warmth. It wasn't just a building. It had a soul. While Susan led the visitors around, Eleanor sat quietly in the garden sipping tea. She didn't want to be inside while strangers walked through her rooms, but she also didn't want to leave completely. The garden was her favorite place, and she found comfort in sitting among the flowers. The gentle sound of the breeze rustling through the leaves calmed her nerves. She could hear faint voices from inside, but she tried not to listen too closely. She reminded herself that it was time to let go. When the showings were done, Susan came out to the garden, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. "It went really well," she said. "People loved the house. You should be proud of what you've created here." Eleanor nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I'm glad," she said. "That's all I wanted." That evening, after everyone had gone, Eleanor went back inside. The house felt still, almost like it was holding its breath. She walked through the rooms once again, feeling the silence settle around her. The house had always been alive with sound, voices, laughter, music, but now it was quiet, waiting for what came next. She sat down in her old armchair and let the memories wash over her. As she sat there, her eyes wandered toward the fireplace. On the mantel sat a small clock that had been there for as long as she could remember. It had belonged to her parents before her, and though it no longer worked, she kept it as a reminder of them. Something about it always made her feel connected to her past. Tonight she noticed something odd. The clock seemed to be slightly tilted, as if it had been moved. Curious, she stood up and lifted it off the mantel. Behind it, she noticed a faint line in the wall, a seam that didn't quite match the rest of the wallpaper. It looked like a small panel, almost hidden. Her heart beat a little faster as she ran her fingers along the edge. The wallpaper was old and brittle, and when she pressed gently, the panel shifted slightly. She paused, unsure if she should continue. But her curiosity got the better of her. She pressed again, harder this time, and the small section of the wall clicked open. Behind it was a small compartment, a hidden space she had never noticed before. Inside was a small tin box, dusty and covered in cobwebs. Eleanor carefully pulled it out and set it on the table. She opened the lid slowly, unsure what she would find. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, were several envelopes and a small velvet pouch. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened one of the envelopes. Inside were old photographs, black and white images of her parents, her husband as a young man, and even her as a child. She hadn't seen some of these pictures in decades. Her eyes welled with tears as she realized how precious they were. She set the photos aside and opened the small pouch. Inside were a few gold coins and a delicate locket. The locket was engraved with her initials and the year 1943, the year she and her husband had married. When she opened it, she saw a tiny picture of the two of them on their wedding day, smiling at each other as if they had the whole world ahead of them. Eleanor held the locket to her chest, overwhelmed by emotion. She hadn't known this secret compartment even existed. It must have been something her husband had built years ago, perhaps to keep their most precious memories safe. Finding it now at this moment felt like a message from him, as if he was reminding her that even though she was saying goodbye to the house, she could never lose what truly mattered. The memories, the love, they would always be hers. The next day she showed Susan what she had found. Susan was amazed. "This is incredible," she said softly. "It's like a piece of history hidden right here in the walls." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "I had no idea it was there," she said. "It's like he left it for me to find." They decided to keep the discovery private for now. The locket and the photographs were too personal to share. But the moment felt meaningful, almost magical. It was as if the house wanted to give her one last gift before she left. In the days that followed, the house continued to attract attention. Word spread about its beauty and the charm that seemed to radiate from every room. Susan received several offers, and soon enough, there was a buyer who seemed perfect, a young couple who had fallen in love with the warmth and character of the home. They were expecting their first child and wanted a place where they could start their life together. When Susan told Eleanor about them, she smiled and nodded. It felt right. A new family, new laughter, new memories. That's what the house needed. The day before the papers were signed, Eleanor decided to visit every part of the house one last time. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand gliding along the railing. The wood felt smooth beneath her fingers, polished by years of touch. She paused in each room, remembering moments both joyful and sad. She laughed softly to herself as she recalled her children playing hide and seek, their giggles echoing through the halls. She felt tears prick her eyes when she remembered the evenings she and her husband had spent sitting together, talking about their dreams. When she reached the attic, she hesitated. The door creaked as she opened it, revealing the dimly lit space filled with the faint smell of old wood and dust. She stepped inside carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar clutter of boxes and furniture. It felt different now, quieter, emptier, yet full of stories. Something caught her eye in the corner. It was an old chest, one she didn't remember seeing before. Maybe it had always been there, hidden behind other things. She knelt down slowly, her knees aching a little, and opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of her husband's old journals and notebooks. The handwriting was neat and steady, the ink faded but still readable. She picked up one of the journals and began to read. The words brought her back to another time. Her husband had written about their early years together, about building the house and about his dreams for their family. One page caught her attention. It described a hidden room in the basement, built for safekeeping during difficult times. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never known about that. Could it still be there? Her curiosity piqued. Eleanor carefully made her way down to the basement. It was dimly lit and the air felt cool and still. She ran her hand along the concrete walls, trying to find any sign of what her husband had written about. For a moment, she thought maybe it was just a story, but then, near one corner, she noticed a small crack in the wall that looked out of place. She tapped it lightly, and the sound was hollow. Her heart raced as she pressed harder, and to her amazement, part of the wall shifted slightly, revealing a hidden doorway. Inside was a small secret room, untouched, preserved in time. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, papers, and small boxes. In the center of the room sat a wooden trunk covered in dust. Eleanor opened it carefully, and what she found inside took her breath away. The trunk was filled with items from generations past, family heirlooms, old letters, and documents that seemed to date back over 100 years. There were coins, jewelry, even some paintings carefully wrapped in cloth. It was like a hidden time capsule, a piece of her family's history preserved through time. She sat there for a long while, overwhelmed with emotion. It was as if the house itself had been keeping these secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Eleanor knew she couldn't take it all with her, but she also knew this discovery was special. She decided to tell Susan about it the next morning, so it could be handled properly. The items could be appraised, preserved, maybe even shared with museums. Her family's history would live on, even after she was gone. That night, Eleanor sat by the fireplace with the locket in her hand. She felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. It was as if the house had given her one final goodbye, a reminder that the past doesn't disappear. It simply lives on in new forms. The walls that had once echoed with her laughter and love would soon hear someone else's, and that thought, instead of making her sad, made her smile. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, she whispered softly, "Thank you." It was a thank you to the house, to the life she had lived, and to the memories that would always stay in her heart. The day finally arrived when the sale was complete. Eleanor stood in the front yard looking at the house one last time. It was a strange feeling, a mix of relief and sadness. The house, once full of her family's laughter, now felt silent, as though it was holding its breath before its next chapter began. She had never imagined this day would come, and yet, here she was, about to walk away from the place she had called home for so many years. Eleanor had spent the past week finalizing everything. The hidden room she'd discovered in the basement had been cleaned out, and some of the antiques and heirlooms were carefully packed and cataloged for future generations to appreciate. She had spoken with Susan about the items, and they made sure everything was properly handled. It was the right thing to do. These pieces of history, these parts of her family's story, deserved to be preserved. Eleanor had learned that letting go of a house didn't mean letting go of everything. The memories, the love, the legacy, those things would always stay with her. The new family who had purchased the house had already moved in. It was a young couple, just starting their own lives, filled with hopes and dreams. Eleanor had met them a few days before the sale went through, and she could tell they would take good care of the house. There was something about them that reminded her of herself and her husband all those years ago, full of possibilities, eager to build a future. The house would be in good hands. As she stood there in the yard looking up at the old windows, she remembered the times when her children had played in the garden. running through the grass, their laughter filling the air. She could almost see them, so small, so full of energy. And then, in the quiet that followed, she remembered her husband. He had always been there beside her, making sure everything was taken care of, helping with the garden, working on the house. His absence still left an empty space in her heart, but she knew he would want her to move forward. He would want her to be at peace with the decision to sell. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She didn't know if she would ever come back to visit. It was hard to imagine standing on this lawn, looking at this house, knowing it belonged to someone else, but she also knew that it was time. The house had been a witness to her entire life, her children's childhoods, her years of marriage, the quiet moments and the loud ones. And now, it was ready to be a part of someone else's story. Turning toward the car parked at the curb, Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude for all that the house had given her. It had been more than just a building. It had been a home, a sanctuary, a place of comfort and love. The house had seen her through good times and bad, and she had seen it change over the years just as she had. It was no longer the same place she had moved into all those years ago, but it was still hers in some way. It would always be hers. As she made her way to the car, Susan arrived, walking briskly down the driveway toward her. She gave Eleanor a warm, knowing smile. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Eleanor nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "I think so. It's time." Susan had been a constant support throughout this whole process, and Eleanor was grateful for her kindness. They had talked many times over the past few weeks about the house, about Eleanor's memories, and about the future. Susan had been more than just a real estate agent. She had been a friend, someone who listened when Eleanor needed to talk, and someone who understood that this wasn't just about selling a house. It was about letting go of a chapter in life. As they stood there together, Susan glanced up at the house. "You did a beautiful job here," she said. "You should be proud of everything you've created." Eleanor smiled, the weight of her emotions lifting slightly. "I am proud," she said softly. "This house has been my life. I've loved every part of it." They stood in silence for a few moments, taking in the view of the house one last time. Eleanor felt the cool breeze on her face, and the sound of birds singing in the trees filled the air. The garden, the trees, the flowers, everything was exactly as it had always been. But somehow everything seemed different now. It was as if the house was ready for something new, something fresh. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. "I'll miss it," Eleanor said quietly, almost to herself. Susan put a hand on her shoulder. "You'll carry the memories with you," she said gently. "That's what matters most," Eleanor nodded. It was true. The memories would stay with her no matter where she went. The house had been a backdrop to her life, but the love she had shared with her family was what really mattered. She had lived a full life, and now it was time to move forward. The house would remain in her heart, but she didn't need to hold on to it any longer. As the car began to pull away, Eleanor took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. She could see the sunlight reflecting off the windows, and for a moment, it felt like she was still standing there in the yard, saying goodbye. But then the house faded from view, and she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was leaving, but she wasn't alone. The memories, the love, the life she had built, those would stay with her forever. The road ahead wasn't clear, but Eleanor felt a sense of excitement, a spark of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready for whatever came next. The house had been a part of her past, but now she was looking toward the future. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take that first step. As they drove away, Eleanor let out a long breath, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. The house was no longer hers, but she knew it was in good hands. The new family would make their own memories there, just as she had. And maybe one day they would look back on their time in the house with the same love and warmth that Eleanor felt now. She smiled softly, her heart full of gratitude. It was time for a new beginning. The past would always be a part of her, but now she was ready to embrace the future. Eleanor knew that whatever came next, she would carry the love and the lessons from her years in that house with her. She was ready to start the next chapter of her life, and for the first time in a long time, she was excited about what the future would bring.